Welcome gentlemen, welcome gentlewomen, and also welcome gentle children. Today is Thursday. We are steadily going into the first week of the first season of Dragonflight, and today we have to talk about drama. Yeah, let's not talk about the world first race, the new Mythic Plus being available, the raid being available as well. Instead, let's talk about some juicy drama which happened in the last couple of days. So, what am I talking about? I'm talking about exploiting. I'm talking about whether or not it is right or wrong to punish those who exploit in search of an advantage, sometimes even a competitive advantage. In this case, the exploiting question which Blizzard targeted was aimed at tailoring. So tailoring has a couple of special crafts for its most rare, its most precious materials, Chronocloth and Azurweave, which are supposed to be gated. It's not just quite like those transmute 12-hour or some of those 24-hour cooldowns we had in the past, but you still were supposed to be limited. Now, what happened since the start of the expansion is that these couple of crafts for tailoring were quite buggy and quite not responsive, to the point that some tailorers were able to just mass craft these two materials for however many times they wanted, for essentially an endless number of times. And it's not that there was an exact, precise way you needed to replicate to cheat the system. It could have been something as simple as crafting the Azurweave bolt, see it go on cooldown, see it no longer have any crafts available, log out, log back in, and you can craft it again. Sometimes it was joining a raid, sometimes it was changing to a different shard, sometimes it was joining a battleground. All these sorts of activities could have just randomly given you more crafts of the Azurweave or the Chronocloth crafts for tailorers. Now, this created, or we should say this destroyed, the economy, in the sense that many of these tailorers were able to get way more of these materials that they were supposed to have compared to all the other tailorers who were still gated by the cooldowns, and this pushed Blizzard to have a response on this. The response on this was to basically dish out a bunch of bans for exploiting. We have seen reports of players being banned for 7 days, 14 days, even a full month because of this exploit. Now, this lasted not too long, because Blizzard very quickly went back on their word. In one of their announcements about this, they point out that earlier today, after further investigation, we came to understand that some of those we suspended likely didn't have a deliberate intent to exploit and were simply doing something that appeared to be naturally available. Because it's not that the UI, the tooltips, and the explanations from the tailoring crafting panel were too clear about this, were too obvious about this. So Blizzard is giving plausible deniability to many of these players, saying that, maybe they actually didn't know they weren't supposed to be doing this. The result is that now we have reversed most of these suspensions so that only the most egregious cases remain penalized. Now, this leads us to an interesting point, because at the start of the expansion, and since the start of the expansion, we have seen already quite a few exploits and quite a few ways for the player base to find out certain methods to bypass or to circumvent Blizzard's ideas of what the players were supposed to do. We have seen a few things which we might just chalk up to Blizzard being forgetful, like for example, the Obsidian key farming grind being way too strong early on, so Blizzard nerfed the amount of mobs spawning. This couldn't really have been considered an exploit, just Blizzard making it a little bit too easy. Still, it annoyed some players, because then the players who did the grind early were essentially rewarded by having to grind for less time than the players who had to go and do the grind after it was nerfed. Same goes for the Cobalt assembly grind. That was also nerfed in the amount of reputation you were getting, but then again, it's not really an exploit, right? It's not that players were consciously doing this because they knew that the rep was bugged and you were getting much more reputation to grind that zone at the moment, so that's also fine. However, especially when it comes to professions, there were quite a few already available exploits in the game. For example, now Blizzard tried to give out a whole ban wave to all of these tailoring exploiters. However, what about alchemy? Alchemy had a similar problem with the files and the potion experimentations. They worked in a very similar way to the Azurweave and the Chronocloth crafting of the tailorers, in the sense that you were doing these experimentations in hopes of finding new recipes for your alchemy crafts, and if you failed, you went on a 4-hour cooldown. And the way you could bypass the cooldown initially was very similar to the way players were able to bypass the cooldown of the tailoring crafts. For example, logging out and logging back in, joining raids, joining dungeons, joining PvP instances. It would randomly reset the cooldown of your experimentations for alchemy. However, we haven't really seen any retaliation from Blizzard because of this exploit from alchemy, for example, but just for tailoring. Talking about professions, there is another exploit. We could even ask ourselves, is this actually an exploit? For example, you might have seen quite a few recipes and quite a few crafts which are very rare right now, and they are put up on the auction house, for example, for a lot, and I mean a lot of gold. Why? Because these are things available from the Artisans Consortium. The Artisan Consortium is that tiny little sub-faction available in Valdrakken, is the one that is going to award you a whole bunch of profession knowledge in exchange for artisans metal, right? And it is gated by reputation, and that reputation is completely gated weekly. Now, a lot of players, for example, have been able to get ahead of the curve compared to other crafters by doing this simple trick. The trick was to learn a profession, get a profession up to level 25, which unlocks the weeklies, do the weekly with the profession, because you complete the weekly, you get reputation, and then once you complete the weekly, you unlearn the profession, you learn a new profession, you get that profession to 25, you get the weeklies, you complete them for rep, and then you unlearn the profession and learn the next one. You repeat this for every available profession, besides the first one you already had. You repeat this all week to get rep with the Artisans Consortium. You could have done this on week 1, you could have repeated this on week 2, and you could have repeated this now on week 3. Every week, essentially, relearning, unlearning, and relearning all of the professions to bypass the gated weekly rep you were supposed to get with the Artisans Consortium by simply repeating the weekly quests for rep. That is something, for example, that is still in the game and is allowing quite a few crafters to get certain recipes and certain rewards from the Artisans Consortium, which Blizzard clearly intended to be gated some 4 weeks into the expansion, 6 weeks into the expansion, and some players are able to get them right now, for example. Could we consider that an exploit? Should Blizzard also go on and land out a full-on ban wave to all of the players who abuse this system, for example? The community about this seems to have been split, which is why I thought it was worth making a video to see what was your opinion about this. Because of course, there is one side of the community pointing out that it's Blizzard's fault, okay? The tooltips, the descriptions in the crafting panel of tailoring was not quite clear. It wasn't obvious from the get-go that the Azure Weave bolt and the Chronocloth bolt were supposed to be some very rare, very limited types of crafts. So if someone didn't know and he could simply see the create button being red and being available to be clicked, then why not click it? How do I know it's not supposed to work like this? The UI of Blizzard is telling me to do so, so I am being completely innocent. And then there is the other side. The other side is saying that is the essence of exploiting. Exploiting is when you can do something that you're not supposed to do, but you do it anyways. So it's the intent that matters, is being able to recognize and know that you're being cheeky, okay? You're being coy, you're just pretending to not know, and then you do it anyways. So realistically, many players ended up pointing out that, if you crafted 5 or 10 more, maybe 15 more, it's okay. But if you completely destabilize the economy with hundreds upon hundreds of these crafts available, then obviously you know very well that this isn't supposed to work like this. You know that you're taking advantage of this for your own gain, and you are aware that this isn't likely supposed to happen. So with this massive ban wave being reverted by Blizzard, as they said, they are only keeping the bans for the more egregious of cases, which we still don't know exactly what that means, but with this ban wave being reverted, then some players go back to the defeated idea of the old saying is indeed true. Exploit early and often. Think about what you can gain, think about the benefits first, and then eventually maybe worry about what Blizzard might do in the future because of what you exploited. That seems to be the norm nowadays in WoW. Whenever it comes to some gray areas, okay, some nebulous possible exploiting or not, rarely do we see Blizzard taking a very harsh stance on players who abuse certain exploits. Instead, they let them go with a slap on the wrist. generally speaking. As I said, what is perhaps also interesting is the fact that at the moment they have only targeted tailoring, even though these types of bypassing of cooldowns have happened in other professions. I mentioned alchemy, for example, with the experimentations. I could also mention alchemy, for example, with the transmuting. Transmuting elements also has a cooldown. I believe it's a 12-hour cooldown, and that could also be bypassed in a very similar way. Get all of your transmutes done, join a PvP battleground, come out of the battleground, all of the transmute cooldowns are now off, and you can transmute again. You would know, obviously, that is not supposed to go off cooldown just because you joined a PvP battleground, for example, and yet it's not that Blizzard has targeted that type of exploiting so far. They just went after the tailoring one. Although, to be fair, the crafting of these epic materials for tailoring was much more impactful to the economy because of what you can craft, the gear you can craft with these epic materials, as opposed to, alchemists getting a few more elements transmuted to a different one, or alchemists discovering a couple more potions from their discovery craft. That's not nearly as impactful as being able to flood the auction house with these epic materials for tailoring. So perhaps that is why Blizzard went, or initially thought of going much harsher on this exploiting when it comes to tailoring. I do believe in the end that for many of the players who did indeed exploit the tailoring, let's just call it bug, it was definitely intentional. Players who were spending hours upon hours on the auction house trying to make money, of course, realized very, very well how much of a cooldown their strongest, biggest, and pricier craft is going to have. Okay, these people are not oblivious. It's not that they are caught by surprise because the Chronocloth craft suddenly has no cooldown. They eventually became quite easily aware that it wasn't supposed to be this fast and this quick to recraft it multiple times over and over again. So obviously, in many of these cases, it was definitely an exploit, and also obviously in many of these cases, many of the players hit by the bans have been acting a little bit oblivious about it. Yeah, I was only crafting it a couple of times a day. Okay, sure, maybe 5 times, but it's not that much. Okay, sure, I spent 15 hours crafting this non-stop, but it's Blizzard's fault, because how was I supposed to know if the tooltips didn't warn me about it? I think perhaps in the end this had a worse impact on the community, because it's not that Blizzard targeted the bans. It looked like it was an automatic ban on pretty much everyone who crafted the bolts. Whether or not you were patiently waiting for your cooldown or not, and you were abusing the shit out of it, crafting hundreds of them every hour, when it would have taken you weeks to get all of those crafts off. Looks like Blizzard banned them all, so of course many innocent people got caught in the middle. So Blizzard, to undo the damage, seems like they went on to unban likely also a few of the players who did indeed exploit the system for the tailoring crafts. So probably with the ban wave, the optics were not on Blizzard's side. I think if they were a little bit more precise with who they targeted with the bans, it would have been more accepted, more given the scale of the exploiting done by these tailorers. But in the end, it looks like, once again, for the most part, exploiting early and exploiting often is paying off once again. So after this, let me guys know what you think about this, especially if you are a tailorer yourself, and if you have encountered this exploit, how did you treat it? Did you pretend you didn't know what it was and started crafting dozens of these epic crafts? Did you actually follow the cooldown? Were you simply unlucky and for you the cooldown never even bugged in the first place, so you had to wait even if you didn't want to? Or did you just shamelessly know very well it wasn't supposed to happen, but you didn't care and you went on to make bank out of this exploit without Blizzard punishing you for it? I would like to know. What's your guys' take on this yet another exploit drama coming in World of Warcraft. This time it wasn't that big, okay, to be fair, it wasn't that massive, but it's still interesting to see the reactions and the ramifications that this response from Blizzard had on these players who took advantage of this problem in the system, in the profession system, the newly released profession system from Dragonflight. With this out of the way, it's time to stop for the day. I have to go back and pay my dues to Mythic Plus, to grinding a little bit more. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of my Patreon supporters for contributing and supporting myself and this channel. You can support in other ways, of course, not including the expenditure of cash. Liking and commenting down below to this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, are always very welcome ways to support. You can also follow me on Twitter as well as subscribing to my Patreon to get access to my Discord server. And lastly, of course, I am also available on Twitch as well. After a few days of pause, after my terrible sleep deprivation blocking me from doing anything productive, we are back streaming today. We are back doing some Mythic Plus spam for the day and also our first raid of the season. So you're all welcome to come in and have a chat on stream, as I do need some mirrors. I do need some people to bounce off my ideas with, because I am quite talkative, so I need people to dialogue with on stream to make it more interesting as well. And generally speaking, as for the timing, it's evening time in EU as well as early to mid-afternoon in the US. So with this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, all this exploiting, all these bugs and ways to cheese the game, and I haven't taken advantage of any of it. I'm dumb.